Hello and welcome back to another DF Direct. I'm John Lindemann, and this time I have a very special guest joining me to discuss all manners of sound projects. This is, of course, the legendary Chris Huelsbeck. Welcome to the show, Chris.
Hi.
How's it going?
Yeah, okay, a little bit jet lagged because
Yeah.
I just arrived in Germany not too long ago, and yeah.
Excellent. Well, today I think the main topic is I wanted to talk to you about some of the sound chips that you've worked on in the past, and sort of, it's interesting. Sound used to be a very different thing than it is today. You really had to program for these machines, and there was a lot of work to be done. You've, of course, done a lot of that across many different machines. But before we get to that, what have you been working on over the last few years?
So the last game I worked on was actually Bubsy, the Woolies Strike Back. And yeah, but that was over a year ago, and then I spent a lot of time finishing up my last Kickstarter project where I promised foolishly to create as a bonus a full new Amiga soundtrack.
So for that, you actually went back to the original hardware and tools then?
Yes, I used my original sound tool from the Amiga and slaved away, and it was much harder than I anticipated.
Yeah, so what kind of challenges did you face with that?
Well, I mean, I'm not 20 anymore, first of all. Back then I did the soundtrack for like a Turrican 2 or whatever, probably in something like 3-4 months. And this time it took me over a year to put the CD full. I made sure that I used the same tools, and I limited myself to the same memory footprint that I would have had back then. And I even, when I did new samples, I used sounds that I would have had available in '95 or so. So that was a challenge in itself.
That's awesome. I guess I should say real quick, big shout out to my good friend Audie Zerly for setting all this up, of course. And I think it's very fitting that you worked on Bubsy, because we all know that he loves Bubsy.
He's a big fan.
And we even did that whole episode on DF Retro, so yeah, that happened. But hey, I think you actually brought along one of the vinyl CD packs here.
Yeah, I did actually.
What do we got? I haven't had a chance to look at this yet.
This is the Turrican Orchestral Selections, our second orchestral Kickstarter that we did to record Turrican music with a live orchestra.
Oh wow.
Huge production, and yeah, it turned out even better than the first one, even though the first one is already amazing, but this is really like the ultimate in sound and whatever. So yeah, and it contains the CD also. There's vinyl in here and art prints, and the CD contains also that Amiga bonus.
Oh yeah, I'm eager to hear that. Yeah. Check it out.
And it's limited. We only made 1,000 of these.
Whoa.
So yeah,
it's really cool.
Another thing that I've been working on for the last few years is actually a website called Patreon, which is also a crowdfunding thing, where it's for ongoing projects, and I do usually I do one music piece a month. Right. And my fans can support me from $1 and whatever. It's kind of like a tip jar, and they get something out of it.
Cool.
And about 2 years ago, I decided to make all the pieces that I did there, and it's over 25 now, royalty free. So everybody who contributes can use all these music pieces for whatever they want. YouTube, they don't have to worry about content ID. You could use it on your channel if you wanted to. And the only thing I'm asking for is a credit.
That sounds good. I guess I'm really just eager to talk about some of the old sound stuff, obviously. I mean, you really made your name back with the tracker software on the C64, the Amiga, but you worked on a lot of the different consoles as well, all the way up through, I guess, like, I mean, you were even working on like PlayStation 3 at some point. How far did you go?
Yeah, but I didn't do the back-end programming for that. I think...
What was the last back-end that you worked on?
The last back-end was probably Super Nintendo and Mega Drive, where I actually have code that I programmed in the game. And then after that, the Genius programmers at Factor 5 advanced it to the next level. But the interesting part is that the TFMX system that I developed on the Commodore 64, and then it was very prominently featured on the Amiga computer, that actually went also onto Super Nintendo, Sega Mega Drive, and later even onto Nintendo 64.
Oh, that's cool. And actually, that's one of the most interesting things. You did a lot of work on Nintendo 64. Yeah. So obviously with Factor 5 guys, you also contributed to the Resident Evil 2 Turrican version, which was sort of a miracle
Right.
port to the system. But the N64 doesn't really have a proper sound chip, does it? So how did you approach like working on a system like that that didn't really have dedicated audio hardware?
Right, so they just gave it the ability to output, I think it was 16-bit sound already, and you had to mix it on the CPU.
Oof.
But it was optimized for that, so you could have in a game, even in Rogue Squadron, I think we had 16 or 20 voices
Okay.
that were software mixed, and I don't know how many were in Resident Evil, but yeah, it was definitely doable. The more limiting factor was probably the memory, because
Right,
you had
right.
to put it on the cartridge,
Of course.
because it was not a CD system yet.
So you basically had to craft samples then that
Yes.
would work within the memory limitations. And kinda, so did you produce music where you tried to say, okay, I want to do this quality, but then it's kicked back and say, no, those samples are too large? Like, how did you deal with that, finding the right balance between sound quality?
Always a balance, yeah. And there's several ways to go about it. You either get like high fidelity instruments, but they have to loop very fast.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Or you do some lower fidelity, but you can have longer loops. And so, yeah, that was always a struggle. But,
Yeah.
you know, I mean, that's like part of the puzzle.
Yeah,
Put
yeah,
that
yeah.
together and make it sound good. And I think just in terms of Rogue Squadron, it still holds up pretty well, actually.
It does, yeah. It's one of the best sounding games in the system, I think. It still sounds suitably Star Wars. Did you actually go back to the original Star Wars like music tracks and samples and then try to pull those in and find ways to massage them to work within the memory constraints?
Well, I mean, all the samples were new, but they
Okay.
were, you know, modeled after symphony orchestra.
Of course.
With, you know, very, very like cut down, of course. But I think I remember spending a good month or so on the title music track. And in fact, I still finished that up in Germany. And it was kind of like the proof that LucasArts needed to bring me over to the US to work with Spectre 5. And that title track convinced them, because I was able to get that into the memory footprint that we wanted with the voices, and it sounded pretty darn good.
Yeah, that's interesting because the original Star Wars game on Nintendo 64 was Shadows of the Empire, which LucasArts produced. And their approach was simply to digitize the music, but they had to play it back at a really low sample rate, so it
Low
sounded
sample
awful.
rate and probably shorter loops.
Exactly, like very short loops, very low sample rate. So the approach you did, and then by breaking it up into the samples, we were able to get very clean sounding audio.
Yeah.
And that's interesting then, because you mentioned that, so the Factor 5 guys came over to the United States in 96 or so, and you were a couple years later?
98.
98.
For Rogue Squadron, actually.
Wow.
I was actually brought over for an initial 9 months, and then we stretched it to a year, and after that they offered me if I wanted to stay.
That's cool.
Yeah.
You did work on Rogue Squadron 2 and 3 as well,
Yes.
right? And
Yeah,
those,
absolutely.
obviously, while we're talking the Nintendo hardware, how did you feel about the upgrade to the audio hardware there? Because the GameCube obviously had significantly more memory and advanced audio capabilities. How did you approach that?
Absolutely.
What were your
but
thoughts on it?
It was still the same system, actually.
Really?
The music system that we did, called Musics,
Mm-hmm.
was actually used on the GameCube as well, because we had a few pieces that we could stream, but not everything, because there was still like stuff that they loaded on the fly.
Oh yeah.
And the codecs were just not quite there yet to crunch it down, so you couldn't do like an MP3 codec per se. Yeah, it progressed and it got better and better, and by Rogue Squadron 3 we had actually a little bit more of the original soundtrack loops mixed
Yeah, I
in with the
remember that.
MIDI. And actually the challenge there was to have like seamless switches between the MIDI music with samples and the actual longer sample snippets that came from the original soundtrack.
Oh yeah.
And that worked actually out, which was nice. And another thing that many people don't know about the Rogue Squadron series is that I actually composed a lot of additional music.
That's
So
right, because you didn't just use the regular Star Wars tracks from John Williams.
say
There's a
it
lot of
was-
new music in
It
there.
was maybe like, in some cases, half and half, or 60% soundtrack, 40% new compositions.
Wow. Okay,
Yeah.
that's really cool.
Eventually it was Rogue Squadron 2 at the end, and Rogue Squadron 3 we also had another composer that helped out, and we really took it to the next level where it sounded like I mean, yeah, it was like the soundtrack.
Yeah,
And in
yeah.
fact, I think now so much time has passed that I can talk a little bit about it. A sad fact is that we had actually recorded music from all 3 Rogue Squadrons with a live orchestra at some point. And it never saw the light of day because of there was some project that was cancelled, and then Factor 5 went under eventually.
Yeah.
And it could have had a release on the Wii.
That's right. Like a
And
full
that never happened.
like a
And
new version with all 3 games on the Wii.
yeah,
That would have
and
been
with
amazing. Yeah.
orchestral recordings of all those tracks. Yeah, so they sit right now in like some drawer at Disney probably,
Yeah.
and nobody knows about them.
That's a shame. I would love to hear that, but
Me
that
too.
kind of stuff
I hope
happens.
maybe you can dream someday. Maybe
Dig it out.
Somebody will be able to use those.
I kind of feel like that's a series that people would welcome back. Like if they were able to bring this back, I think Rogue Squadron would do pretty well. And the games themselves still look great today.
Yeah.
So it's like, why not bring them back? We don't have anything like that these days.
I
So
know.
thinking of Factor 5, were you involved in the Indiana Jones project as well? They did Infernal Machine on N64.
I think it was a Super Nintendo game, actually.
Oh yeah, that's right.
Earlier Indiana Jones, where I did some tracks.
That was like the Chronicles of Indiana Jones.
But it was that was straight conversion from the soundtrack.
Right. So
But it
new
was still a
music.
challenge, and it was fun to do that because I'm a big fan of John Williams.
Of
And
course.
to squeeze that kind of, like orchestra stuff into such small space is a special challenge and fun.
Okay, so that's actually interesting then. Super NES and Mega Drive. I love these systems. I'm especially partial to the Mega Drive though. They're both great. But I'm curious, from somebody that's actually worked on the music side of things, they're very different in terms of the way the sound hardware is designed.
Oh yeah.
What were your thoughts on each machine and working with them basically?
Well, the Super Nintendo was really nice because I could actually go from my Amiga 7 voice system, which I had, and use the Amiga to compose the music, and then basically with few limitations straightly port it to the Super Nintendo. On the Mega Drive, on the other hand, you had the FM sound chip and the PSG with few voices, and then the Factor 5 guys, Thomas Engel, he did an amazing efficient sample mixer for 2 channels of samples
two
for
PCM
like
channels.
drums and things like that.
Great.
Yeah, so that was fun in itself because of all the different styles and flavors of sound chips. So
Yeah. I feel like the kind of the look and feel of something like Mega Turrican actually works pretty well though with the FM synth. It's kind of that grungy metallic sound. So
Yeah.
I like it. I think it sounds cool.
It definitely has a special place. And yeah, one interesting anecdote there is that for the sample mixing, Factor 5 used the Z80 processor.
Oh, really?
Yeah, that was actually reserved for Master System
Some use.
compatibility, and it was not supposed to be used while the 68,000 was running at the same time. But they managed to do it, and they got through all the checks from Sega, and it went through and it worked. We were always like wondering why they prohibited it. Was it because the machine would get too hot, or could it unexpectedly crash, or would it like use too much power and break the power supply? I don't know what it was. Ultimately, I think maybe they thought about putting out a machine later that didn't have the C80.
Right. Oh, yeah. They could
could
strip
be.
that out because they
Yeah.
had to use it for Master System backwards compatibility.
Right.
So maybe that's possible.
That's
So what do you think then? Super NES or Mega Drive? Which sound chip do you personally prefer?
That's a really tough choice, but I really like the challenge of the Mega Drive, and I still like the sound of it. It's, as you said, like crunchy.
Yeah.
Kind of. The Super Nintendo was like very clean and almost a little bit dull compared to like the Amiga, but it was kind of like it was a little bit softer.
Yeah, you're right. Everything
had
was
that
32
soft
kilohertz,
quality.
and it was
Yeah.
kind of like soft fall off on the channels. And
Yeah,
yeah, I know what you mean. It was a very different sound.
yeah.
I mean, you never got. There's a lot of systems from that era that you didn't actually get to work on. Was there any that you really regret that you didn't get to spend time with? Like you didn't really do anything on PlayStation, right? You didn't do anything on Saturn.
I did one game, at least on PlayStation, which is Tunnel B1.
Oh,
but
Tunnel
it was-
B1. That's a
but
local
it wa-
game too.
That was my first, well, it was actually my second Red Book game because the Jim Power was released on
course. That's an
on
awesome
the PC
soundtrack.
engine with the CD-ROM. But Tunnel B1 was the first one that I did officially for a system that was available in Europe. So yeah.
That's actually interesting then, because you're right. The switch to Red Book audio kind of meant that you didn't have the same limitations as the consoles, because it was just you could make whatever music you wanted and then put it on the disc.
Yeah.
How did you feel about that? Like, did you feel like that took away from some of the fun and challenge, or were you just like, well, this is great, I can just make whatever?
Yeah, at first it was definitely great that freedom to do whatever you wanted with the with the power of the studio recording and all those machines that you had. But I don't know. I mean, chip music still has like a special place in my heart.
Yeah, exactly. Me too. It has a certain sound to it. And yeah, the Jim Power soundtrack is really good, by the way. If you guys haven't heard that, do listen to that. It's a very disorienting game to play due to the way they do the parallax scrolling layers.
Right.
But the soundtrack's really, really good. And
Yes.
you used your
Right.
7-channel trick for that. Actually, you know what? We should explain that. Tell us about the 7-channel trick on the Amiga, just so people understand what this is about, because this was really cool.
So let's go back a little bit on the Commodore 64,
C64.
where I already had like a fourth and pseudo fifth channel, because the sound chip only has 3 voices. But I figured out a trick to play samples along with the sound chip voices, and so I had 4, and then I multiplexed those to make like 2 sounds almost at the same time. You know, you could have a drum sound and some bass sound, even with pitches, and play them along, and then you would have 3 SID channels to play like chords and more interesting things.
Yeah.
So I used that quite a bit, and then when I switched to the Amiga, I was obviously happy that it had samples, and you could already like sample a whole chord onto one channel, and you had 3 more. And but in my mind already, I thought like, couldn't we also do software voices on the Amiga? And I experimented a little bit, and the first version that I tried was to mix 2 sample channels onto each one of the 4 Amiga channels. That would have been 8.
Okay.
But the sound quality was very bad.
Oh, yeah.
And the quality was also not there, and the code was not that efficient. But then I saw a software mixer from a friend and colleague in the industry, Jochen Hippel.
Of course.
He wrote a basically emulation of the Amiga sound on the Atari ST.
Wow.
And his main goal was to play tracker mod files and my TFMX, which he also ported over to play those 4-voice Amiga things on the Atari ST. And that sounded pretty good, and it was his code was very efficient. So then I asked him, hey, could you give me your source code? And I tried to port it back to the Amiga, and then mix that into one Amiga channel.
Right.
And the idea that I had was like, okay, you have those 4 voices and then you have 3 regular hardware voices that are untouched. So everything that doesn't sound as good on the software voices, like drums and bass and things like that, they don't degrade that much. You play them on those 4 software voices and then you still have the 3 Amiga channels for the more higher end sounds. Like bells or hi-hats or things like that.
What was the first game that you actually used this in then?
Turrican 2.
So it was Turrican 2.
Yeah. And it was really also the showcase that title music. If you listen to the intro of it, it's essentially like the composition follows that showcasing of the voices because it adds like voice after voice after voice, and you're like, where's this coming from? You know, that was, yeah. And then of course it plays the theme from Turrican 1, and then it goes into Turrican 2 theme, and it's still probably the best.
It sounds
received composition that I did for the fans.
Developers were still figuring out all these new tricks on the hardware, and it wasn't immediately apparent what you could or could not do. So as you're buying games for the computers, you pop in a new game and you might hear or see something that you've never seen before. And it was just like, I didn't realize you could do this on the machine. And that's kind of a feeling that I miss a little bit today. Like you don't really get that feeling anymore. Like it does feel like, okay, well, this is neat and an impressive evolution, but not like, you don't feel like, oh, I've never heard this before or seen this before. It's just like more evolution rather than revolution.
Yeah, definitely.
So then I guess obviously C64 then was kind of your main roots and stuff like Gianna Sisters, of course. And what's your take on the old SID chip then? Because I love the sound of it, but how was it to work on it?
That's probably my favorite sound chip of all times in that sense. And it's amazing that it's actually still relevant to this day with the fans. And but it was like my childhood dream was to make synthesizer music. And when I was in my teenager years, I so wanted to own a synthesizer, but my family couldn't afford that. It was so expensive. So then I read in a magazine that the Commodore 64 had a synthesizer sound chip, and I thought that's my way in, my chance to do synthesizer music. Then I also wanted to I was actually interested in game development as well. Game design. And back then you could almost do a game still by yourself.
That's right, yep.
Or with a very small team. And turned out I wasn't such a good game designer, but a friend of mine, he had already sold a game to a company and was working on a second game. And he wasn't good for sound, so he needed music.
Perfect.
I made music for his game, and that became my first game music.
When you eventually, obviously, then you did have an opportunity to get your first real synthesizer sort of system. What was the first one you got?
The Ensoniq ESQ1, which was just a few months after I did Shades, the track that won magazine contest. I approached Rainbow Arts if they needed help with their game music. My first paid gigs there, and they offered me a job in-house right away.
That's excellent.
So at 19 years old, I started working for them. And one of the requests that I had was that they would sponsor a synthesizer. And that was the Ensoniq ESQ1. The interesting part there is I was drawn to the ESQ1 because it was actually at the time something revolutionary.
Right.
because it could play several different sounds at the same time, and it had a sequencer built in. And I immediately enjoyed the structure, how it was laid out, even though it didn't have all those knobs to twiddle like the old machines. It was a digital system, but it had a very analog, old-style layout. And I found out later that the guy who designed that synthesizer was the designer of the SID chip. Yeah.
It's like fate.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
It had to be.
So what is your favorite synthesizer then that you've had over the years?
That's a good question. I would have to say the ESQ1. Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
What kind of gear do you have these days then?
Around 2000, Steinberg, the company that I always use for sequencing and all that stuff, MIDI and audio stuff, they developed the VST standard, which stands for Virtual Studio Technology.
Of course.
And when I saw that working for the first time with a few effects and a very simple software synthesizer, I immediately saw the future.
Yes.
In the mid-90s, I actually had a pretty sizable studio with like many machines and lots of cables and mixing desks, and a ton of money was in there, and it was actually very difficult to bring that all over to the US.
Yeah, of course.
But the main components I did bring over, but I saw the writing on the wall, you know, with computing power getting always better, and these things that it would go virtual. And I actually managed to go fully virtual by 2006, 2007. And I did an album completely virtual.
Using virtual studio technology.
Virtual studio synths and
cool.
effects just with that. And over the years I sold everything, and I work on a laptop now.
Wow.
Yeah, it's
Very
a pretty
different
powerful
approach.
laptop, but it's amazing what you can do. I can do more with that laptop, probably times 10, what I could do in the 90s in that studio.
Is there any project that sticks out in your mind as like this was the most fun to do, or this was you have the best memories of working on it?
It's got to be the Turrican series.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Because it was completely my music, my brainchild, what I put in there, and it was essentially what I was dreaming about as a kid.
Right.
I wanted to do was electronic music, and then of course, because it was an action game, it had that driving beat.
Of course.
But all that melodic synthesizer stuff was represented in there, and I really I built quite a catalog with that. And even to this day, as you can tell from the orchestral Kickstarters and everything, the fans still support that.
Absolutely.
They make that happen.
It's great stuff, man.
Yeah.
This is just sort of scratching the surface, though, in a more casual setting. We're also here to work on a little bit more of an in-depth documentary style video for DF Retro that you can probably expect sometime next year, early at some point. That's going to be a little bit more in depth, but you know, I thought it would be fun here to, you know, sit down with you for a little bit and discuss some thoughts on the old sound hardware, and I love it. It's great stuff.
Yeah.
Amazing work after all these years. So
Thank you.
And if you guys enjoyed this special video, as always, be sure to like and subscribe. Of course, ring the notification bell and follow us over on Twitter. And definitely go check out Chris's work over on Patreon and everywhere else. And yeah, how can you not? It's great stuff. But until next time, stay retro.